Okay, so welcome everyone. And today we are fortunate to have our graduate student, Kelsey Granger. And I think everybody knows Kelsey because she's been sending out the emails for this seminar series for several years now. And she's a PhD student, finishing PhD student at the faculty, and she's worked on dogs and medieval China in general. And today she's going to talk about rugs and rattan, and so different chair-like things along the Silk Road. So please welcome Kelsey Granger.
Hi, thank you very much for your kind introduction, Professor Galambos. As many of you know, I'm usually the person sending you all of the various emails. And as Professor Galambos said, I normally work on pet animals and all sorts of other things in the medieval period. So this is a little bit further away from my research topic, but I hope I will do furniture justice. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully it will work. Can everyone see the presentation?
Yes.
Fab. And can everyone still hear me?
Yes.
Great, fab. Okay. So sitting on the floor and sitting on a chair are vastly different experiences, particularly in the context of eating and socializing. These two ways of sitting mean that the height of accompanying tables must necessarily be altered, as will the ceilings, windows, screens, and viewpoints in the room. Postures and gestures will also differ, as will clothing and hemlines to promote comfort when seated. The move from floor seating to chairs has been described as revolutionary by both Donald Holtzman and Sarah Handler. And in the words of John Kieschnick, entire industries withered and died with the rise of the chair, while other enterprises rose up with it. Stunning too is how quickly such a change occurred in China. Chairs had become de rigueur among most households by the end of the 11th century, despite the earliest recognizable depiction of a chair in the setting of a home dating to the mid-8th century. The most famous example of this rapid and all-encompassing adoption of chair sitting is Han Xizai Ye Yan Tu, attributed to Gu Hongzhong, in which the sheer variety and ubiquity of chairs speaks to this prolific new mode of sitting. The study of the history of the chair in China has burgeoned over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, with scholars seeking to explain why the move from floor seating to chair seating came about, what the impetus for producing chairs might have been, and the diffusion of this habit over time. Two items, however, have been relegated to side notes in these studies: the hourglass stool and the fringed rug. There are numerous depictions and descriptions of these items in the medieval period, and I would like to bring some of these sources to light today. Both of these developments can be considered to be tangential phenomena intimately connected with the adoption of the chair in Chinese history and inextricably linked to the subsequent revolution in sitting customs during this period. But studying them in their own right is also long overdue. So first, I will be summarizing the sitting customs of early China and the Tang period, as well as current scholarly arguments regarding the possible impetus for the move to chair seating. I will then present sources related to hourglass stools and fringed rugs in order to add greater nuance to the history of Chinese furniture, the social history of sitting, and the deep links these particular phenomena share with the Silk Roads. Text and material sources show that kneeling with or without a mat was the norm in early China when eating, playing games, and receiving visitors. So we can see a feast scene here, and we can see playing games on the image here, and then sitting here. These mats were of various sizes, which were largely rectangular in shape and were plain without fringing. Multiple people could sit on larger mats, as seen in this example as well. And I have to thank Heine for pointing out this example to me. One's posture when sitting was an important marker of one's social standing, and the fashion in which one sat also mattered in terms of social hierarchies. One could kneel or sit cross-legged, depending on the social standing of those around you, but to sit with the legs out in front was, at least from the Zhou period, deemed inappropriate. earning Yuanrang a sharp rebuttal and a rap across the shins for doing so in the presence of Confucius. Indeed, prescriptive texts concerning etiquette and propriety go into great detail concerning how and where one should sit on these mats and how to interact with others who are sitting or standing. For instance, several points are raised in Li Ji. On posture, it is advised, do not listen with the head inclined, do not reply with a shout, do not look with lewdness, and do not carelessly slouch. When traveling, do not stride with arrogance. When standing, do not lean on one leg. When sitting, do not have your knees apart, and when lying, do not lie prostrate. Mats should also be laid out in a very specific way, i.e., except in the case of guests who are there simply to eat and drink, in spreading the mats, a space of 10 cubits should be left between them. When the host kneels to adjust the mats of a visitor, the other should kneel and keep hold of them, declining the honor. When the visitor wishes to remove one or more, the host should firmly decline to permit him to do so. When the visitor steps on his mats, the host takes his seat. The manner of sitting on the mats, particularly where to position oneself on the mat, is also strictly outlined. So when a pupil is about to go to his mat, he should not look discomposed. With his two hands, he should hold up his lower garment so that the bottom of it may be a cubit from the ground. His clothes should not hang loosely about him, nor should there be any hurried movements of his feet. If any writing or tablets of his master or his lute or cithern be in the way, he should kneel down and remove them, taking care not to disarrange them. When sitting and doing nothing, he should keep quite at the back of his mat. When eating, quite at the front of it. He should sit quietly and keep a watch on his countenance. And finally, even women were not exempt from the etiquette and gestures that define status, respect, and here, gender. When a young lady is promised in marriage, she wears the strings hanging down to her neck, and unless there be some great occasion, no male enters the door of her apartment. When a married aunt or sister or daughter returns home on a visit, no brother of the family should sit with her on the same mat or eat with her from the same dish. Even the father and daughter should not occupy the same mat. Clearly, how one positioned oneself on the mat in spatial terms, the gesture and posture one adopted, and how one adapted these behaviors according to the intentions and comparative status of those around you were key markers of social etiquette and the performance of one's status. The mat then acts as a medium or arena upon which these abstract social concerns can be manifested, discussed, shaped, and judged. That is not to say that people in the pre-Tang period sat, ate, socialized, and slept on the ground or on mats. There were raised furniture items which could be seen among elite homes in the Eastern Han period. Leaving aside the chuang or couch, which was largely a large seating platform for sitting, resting, and even laying out the dead in Zhou texts, two further forms of raised seating were the ta and the hu chuang, both appearing in sources from the Eastern Han period onwards. The ta seems to be a low platform of varying size upon which one kneeled, much in the same vein as one kneeled on a mat. We can see one such ta as excavated here, which even has a small armrest. This furniture item is mentioned several times in the Eastern Han work Fengsu Tongyi, and is most clearly contrasted with the chuang or couch used for sleeping. The ta is defined in Shiming as that which people sit and sleep on is called a chuang. Chuang is zhuang, to dress, and is used for one to dress and adorn oneself. A long, narrow, and low chuang is called a ta. It is said that surely it is a quail ta, as in the kind of bird, a quail ta, since it is close to the ground. Arguments for the ta being the antecedent of the chair are difficult to disprove, but scholars largely contend that the chair more likely developed from the foreign stool or huchuang seen in sources from the 6th century. The earliest known sources depicting the huchuang include a 543 dated stele of a man sat on a huchuang, which we can see at the bottom here. A 547 dated figurine of a woman carrying one, which we can see up here. And a seated warrior from a Suitang Mogao Cave 420, which looks very much like he's wearing a sleeping bag. These depictions illustrate that these were folding stools with a soft material seat upon which one sat with the legs hanging down, a marked change from the typical kneeling position seen until now. Though huchuang are mentioned in earlier texts, it is not clear whether this was a particularly widespread seating practice prior to these 6th century visual examples, being mentioned as one of Emperor Lingdi's many foreign interests. Its marked foreignness in this textual reference thus suggests that the huchuang was, at this point, a foreign oddity, which may have even been intended in a derogatory manner as a way of criticizing the emperor. Indeed, it may not have even referred to a furniture item at all, but more a manner of sitting generally. Indeed, it isn't until the 3rd or 4th centuries that we see consistent textual references to the huchuang as a furniture item. In the intervening centuries, this folding stool came to be found in a variety of locations, such as the battlefield, palace, or in the home, without pejorative implications. 2 women on the engraving on Li Shou's coffin can be seen carrying huchuang. One woman up here appears to be carrying an hourglass stool, and we're going to be coming back to this image shortly. With a backrest slowly being incorporated into the design over the centuries, huchuang became veritable folding chairs, or tiaoyi, as we can see here. The fact that the huchuang was the first seat to encourage a position in which the legs hung down has meant that many early scholars saw this as being the antecedent of both the folding and fixed frame chair. However, is this actually the case, and what can the analysis of hourglass stools add to the discussion? It's important to note that there are 2 kinds of chair referenced in the Song dynasty, one with a rigid frame and one folding. Certainly the huchuang seems to have been the antecedent to the folding chair, but as the later Song historian Hu Sanxing argues, it may not necessarily have been the antecedent to the fixed frame chair. He counters Cheng Daocheng's argument that the huchuang was also termed as the shengchuang, or corded chair, mentioned as being sat on by Emperor Muzong of the Tang. Instead, he argued that this corded chair was an entirely different object made of a rigid frame with a wide seat to sit on, along with armrests, a backrest, and 4 solid legs, instead of a crisscross wooden frame with a suspended seat. So the original Zizhi Tongtian text states that on the 12th month, a Xinmao day, the emperor met a group of officials at the Purple Dawn Hall and sat on a great shengchuang. Zhong Dacheng, in his Yanfen Lu, states that nowadays the way of making folding chairs originally came from the northern barbarians, and at first were called huchuang. In the Sui, owing to a prophecy regarding hu, these were changed to folding chairs. As for Tang Emperor Muzong sitting on a great shengchuang in the Purple Dawn Hall to meet with a group of officials, this, a folding chair, is then just another name for shengchuang. In my opinion, says Hu Sanxing, folding chairs and shengchuang are both in present-day homes, but these are 2 different things. The folding chair is made of a crisscrossing wood frame for legs, and in between the legs is a horizontal piece of wood which levels out the base, and when it is interlocked on the ground, keeps it stable. At the top of the legs, there is another horizontal piece of wood between the legs, which levels out the top, and the horizontal piece of wood has several rows of holes from which you can thread a woven seat and can thus sit on it. The point where the legs interlock is made round, and drilling in a screw here means that when you push it closed, you can pick it up, and when you open it out, you can sit on it. As its legs are interlocking, it's called a folding, literally an interlocking chair. As for the shengchuang, it is made of planks, and people sit on top of it, and you can even have rattan in between as a seat. You can have a backrest, and to the left and right, you can have arms to rest on. And below, there are 4 fixed legs. The shengchuang then seems a far more likely candidate for the later fixed frame chair seen in China. In 1965, C.P. Fitzgerald claimed that the concept of a fixed frame chair reached China via Nestorian missionaries. This has been challenged by both Holtzman and Kieschnick in more recent years. As both make clear, the lack of fixed frame chairs prior to the mid-8th century was not due to a technological flaw or limitation, but rather because of a cultural issue. As Kieschnick summarizes, the shift to the chair required a dramatic shift in etiquette rather than a technological improvement promising obvious and compelling advantages. Referenced and depicted in relation to Buddhist monks, our earliest depiction of a shengchuang can be seen in Dunhuang Mogao Cave 285, dated to approximately 539, where a monk can be seen sat cross-legged here. It seems to be a seat for meditation, and indeed may have been intended to keep the practitioner out of the reach of snakes and other dangers. These chairs are referenced again and again in various biographies of monks and other meditation texts, reinforcing their strong link with Buddhism and in particular the act of meditation. 2 stelae from 535 to 540 up here, and 566 down here. You can just see it, just here. Also depict monks in chairs, here sat on with the legs hanging down. The use of corded chairs and chairs of other forms in Chinese monasteries, as derived from Indic Buddhist traditions, is unquestionable, with Daoxuan and Yi Jing both describing an array of chairs for various uses within monasteries. For instance, Daoxuan states that in China, there are those who use the shengchuang, but most sit on straw mats on the ground, and for this reason, the nishidana is rolled on top of the straw. I have heard that the ancients had chuang, and at that time, those higher than the rank of dafu would use them, while those all below used mats on the ground. From the Eastern Jin period, chuang began to be more popular, and nowadays monasteries set out many types of seat using both mats and seats, and this causes much inconvenience during the ordination ceremony. Yi Jing, on the other hand, mostly discusses at very great length the inability of Chinese monks to sit on raised seats when eating, with their legs hanging down, with many seemingly sitting cross-legged balanced on top. The most interesting part of this section is arguably the opening, which states, in India, the priests wash their hands and feet before meals and sit on separate small chairs. The chair is about 7 inches high by a foot square, and the seat of it is wickerwork made of rattan cane. The legs are rounded, and on the whole, the chair is not heavy. As Yi Jing's comments make clear, sitting on chairs for meditation may have allowed for both cross-legged and hanging leg sitting positions, but clearly there was a discomfort with sitting correctly on other types of seats, which irked him greatly. The reference to Rattan here will be returned to in due course. Kieschnick, building on arguments made by Holtzman, contends that the strong association between corded chairs and meditation meant it was first adopted by lay believers in their meditation practices before being incorporated into Tang poetry and being enjoyed by the court. Thus, this monastic furniture spread among the elites of China and beyond. This theory is, however, based on a limited number of sources. Besides Tang poems which mention the shengchuang as a meditative tool or space, a 7-jewel corded chair was given as a tribute gift by the king of Malaya via the tantric monk Vajrabodhi to the court in 719. Then, a Tang mural, dated to 756, depicts some form of fixed frame chair sat on by a man with his legs hanging down. Indeed, we're also told that lower status Chinese couple Shi Qing and his wife Miss Wang have chairs in the tomb mural on the northern wall of their 831 to 858 tomb, but images of this mural seem to have yet to be published, or at least that I found so far. Notably, Yi Jing also specified that these seats were at least partially made of rattan, hence the term corded or sheng being used to describe these furniture pieces. The theory that this piece of monastic furniture diffused beyond both the cloisters and the court and into elite homes, and from there spread more widely still, presupposes 3 things. First, that rattan was readily available for the expanded consumption of corded chairs prior to the adoption of hardwood chairs. Second, that a clear use and purpose appealed to consumers, even if this varied according to class, status, occupation, gender, etc. And third, that the item could be understood, adopted, and adapted to be integrated in some aspect of people's lives. Given that shengchuang was not the only rattan item to be incorporated into the visual arts, craftsmanship, and lifestyle of China during the Tang Dynasty, the trajectory of the hourglass stool adds to our discussion of the adoption of chair sitting in China and to the assumptions that underline the role of the shengchuang in this process. I first noticed the hourglass stool during my doctoral research on the lapdog in Tangsong, China, which we can see lapdogs here and lapdogs there. A sudden but sustained trend for lapdog keeping emerged during the Tang Dynasty and is evident in textual material excavated sources from the 7th century onwards. Described as being from Fulin, Turfan, and Samarkand in turn, textual references place these animals firmly in the context of Silk Road trade and transmission. The abruptness of their appearance in Chinese sources, the direct references to their foreign origins, and their association with other exotica like gold, incense, and rattan furniture all intimately connect these animals with Silk Road trade. Moreover, these animals were largely depicted with women and children in ceramics, murals, texts, even silverware. Their ubiquity in the female sphere is particularly striking as compared with other dogs. In one 8th century ceramic, a lapdog can be seen next to a court lady's discarded slipper as she sits with her legs crossed on an hourglass-shaped stool. The Metropolitan Museum suggests the stool may have been made of rattan. Rattan itself encompasses about 600 species of climbing palms under the subfamily Calamodiae, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, found in tropical Asia and Africa. with the most common rattan, Michaelmas, mostly existing in Asia, while the remaining genera are found in Southeast Asia. It is estimated that about 20% of these species are economically important in manufacturing rattanware, though some can also produce edible fruits. Certain rattan grow with a single trunk, while others produce clusters much like bamboo and typically resemble the stem of a rose. Once harvested and with the removal of the thorny outer layer, the clean stems are similar to bamboo, though not hollow. These are nowadays smoked to change the color from green to the pale yellow that we're familiar with. As these stems can be bent into various woven structures and contain paints and pigments like wood is able to, it has long been used in furniture production. In Chinese sources, it is referenced to as tung, which itself simply means vine, in some cases referring to certain incenses like heartwood. It is only clear that tung references rattan, specifically in the context of furniture and vessels, i.e. rattanware. There are also two further Tang ceramics which both feature a court woman sat on an hourglass stool with a phoenix headdress and a bird perched on their hand. Unfortunately, images of the stool itself are not available, but on closer inspection, we can see the outline of an hourglass-like shape, and we can see slight detailings of a ribbed effect as well. A further example, this time sold at Christie's, shows another variation in the appearance of these hourglass stools, with the waistband of this stool being much higher and the shape of the stool therefore being far less symmetrical. A further ceramic combining the phoenix headdress and the holding of a stem seen in the aforementioned examples was sold from a private collection at Sotheby's. Here yet another variation in the shape of the stool can be seen, with the rattan being woven in diagonal strips, which you can just see here. This is our clearest pictorial evidence thus far of one method of constructing these stools. The rattan strips, supported by a woven waistband, are arrayed so as to effectively take the weight of a person. Indeed, a further example of such a design can be seen in an excavated Tang ceramic from a Luoyang tomb. Equally, a ceramic from Wang family tomb 90 in Xi'an and another ceramic from the Freer Sackler galleries show yet another variation in these stool designs. Two further examples have been previously understood as also representing hourglass stools. However, I would like to take a moment to bring this assessment into question. This would be the engraving on Li Shou's coffin, which we saw earlier, and a Northern Dynasty's earthenware piece from the Alfoljai private collection, which both seem to show women carrying waisted stools, highlighting their portability. However, as engravings from Li Shou's coffin show, drums could be depicted in a similar manner and to a similar scale, held across the body by the musician in the same manner as the two women carry these stools. In the first instance, the woman from Li Shou's coffin is positioned among 23 women, all carrying various objects, including the Dunhuang that we saw earlier and a neck rest. The lack of a musical context means that this can still be considered as an hourglass stool. However, the ceramic is far less clear, given that we lack the proper context for how this earthenware piece interacted with the now unknown pieces around it. With the ambiguity of whether this is a drum or a stool, I will therefore not be including this earthenware example in my discussion. These are not the only ceramics to show women sat on hourglass stools, a stark change from those that depict women stood or kneeling, with the latter position reflecting the continued use of floor seating and mats. Beyond palace women, these stools can also be seen in Buddhist visual materials from Dunhuang. 4 Tianwang, or heavenly kings, are seen seated on hourglass stools in Mogao Cave 331, while a female lay believer, if I just move this to there, a female lay believer can be seen just sat on one here, and these might also be further pieces of rattanware as well. Two Dunhuang manuscripts also showed further Buddhist figures on hourglass stools, the first being identified as Avalokiteshvara in Paleo-Chinois 4513, by Xiongquan and Liu Xianbo. The second manuscript, Paleo-Chinois 2598, may be a potential depiction of Vaishravana. This sketch shows an hourglass stool along with 3 lapdogs, which we saw earlier. Here they are. Which again is why this sketch incited my interest. This manuscript features student-copied didactic texts on the recto and writing exercises, sketches, and further colophons in different hands on the verso. The two verso 873 and 883 dated colophons give a vague time frame for when this manuscript was in use. However, the sketches may well have been completed after these dates, given Sarah Fraser's analysis of practice sketches usually being drawn on discarded manuscripts. Next to two saluki, a greyhound, and 3 lapdogs, an armored man sits on an hourglass stool atop a decorated fringed rug. Leaving aside the rug, I have discussed the possible identification of the seated figure as being Vaishravana in a recent article. This identification mostly relied on the similarity of the exaggerated breastplate, sheathed sword, and positioning seen between this sketch and an 8th century relic box from the Famen temple. Interestingly, no waistband is shown on the stool in this sketch. Of course, if this is a practice sketch, then it may be that what looks like a plain hourglass stool could be intended as something more ornate in reality. Further practice sketches on the verso of Paleo-Chinois 2002 show women sat on undetailed stools. We can see the undetailed stools here, and then you can't even really see the stools here and here. As well as a scholar who is perched on top of an unwasted woven stool here. You can see scorch marks to the top edge of the scroll here, and the recto contains a copy of the Taoist text, which, because of the scorch marks, Sarah Fraser takes as being a discarded manuscript. Again, as a practice sketch, it is not clear whether these stools would have been detailed in line with the examples seen thus far or not. However, it is clear that image makers were incorporating rattan, hourglass, and unwasted stools in secular imagery, as well as in Buddhist compositions in murals, manuscripts, and ceramics. Of course, hourglass stools could be made with rattan, but perhaps also other materials to achieve the various designs and shapes seen. Discounting the Northern Dynasty's depiction, which may in fact show a drum rather than a stool, the earliest of the depictions dates into the 7th century. Evidence from Dunhuang suggests a transmission of Buddhist imagery incorporating these stools on the overland silk roads and pilgrim routes. Furthermore, a similar stool can be seen in a mural from the Kizil Caves, again suggesting a Central Asian route of transmission for images of these stools. This is reinforced by the fact that Sogdian sarcophagi from the capital region also feature the same woven stools. The 592 dated sarcophagus of Yuheng, excavated in Taiyuan in 1999, shows 2 such hourglass stools, one on the actual sarcophagus itself, and another on the platform that supports the sarcophagus. Another can also be seen in the 573 dated sarcophagus of Yidu, which was excavated in Qingzhou. Drawings and ceramics largely present us with a harmonious view of these stools, clearly all used for sitting on with the legs hanging down or perhaps crossed, with, in most cases, a clearly defined waistband. Practice sketches from Paleo-Chinois 2002 also indicate that other shapes of stool, again linked to rattan, may have existed, and reveal that image makers were practicing how to draw scholars, but overarchingly women perching on these stools. The visual corpus is far less harmonious regarding the potential function of these stools. Hourglass stools could be used by palace women for seemingly secular use, for Buddhist figures and in Buddhist context with a religious overtone, and in the mortuary art of Zoroastrian Sogdians. The limits of drawings, murals, engravings, and ceramics is that the exact design of the stools is also not always entirely clear, as negative space, hollowness, and joinery are not detailed. The textual record may then make some of these conflicting, broad, or vague aspects clearer. Tang text can refer to these items as chuanti, which elsewhere signifies a rabbit or fish trap made of bamboo. And so context is essential in deciding whether chuanti is referring to a stool or a trap, or chuantai. Both terms are equated with each other as linguistic errors in the Tang dynasty Beihulu, which discusses plants and animals in the south. The same text states that Xinzhou produces exquisite multicolored rattan hourglass stools, and then quotes from a Liang dynasty text by Liu Xiaoyi entitled "In Gratitude to the Prince for a 5-colored rattan hourglass stool," which states that rattan from Yenzhou is the most beautiful. This reference to the Liang dynasty in the south of China immediately predates the earliest visual evidence, that of Yidu's sarcophagus in 573, by as much as 70 years. Indeed, the Liang Shu references chuanti as being some kind of seat in passing references, So it states, in the second year of the Dabao reign era, Hou Jing installed an hourglass stool on the palanquin and sat on it with the legs hanging down. On the couch, he always had a hutuang and an hourglass stool and sat on both with the legs hanging down in his high boots. This text thus clarifies that in the 6th century, both the hutuang and the tuenti or hourglass stool were sat on in the same way, i.e. with the legs hanging down. Liu Xiaoyi's text title then clarifies that these could be made of rattan and that they were colored, and indeed the Sogdian example from Yuhong's sarcophagus was painted in many colors. What is particularly interesting is that centers producing rattan in the Liang period and for manufacturing rattan stools in the Tang were both located in the south. Tongdian, compiled in 801, also mentions Tuantai in the context of tribute from Haifeng in Xunzhou. This is repeated in the later Xintang Shuo, which also notes that Yan Dejun produces multicolored rattan dishes, while Lingfangjun, Xiangjun, and Chonghuajun all produce rattanware. These places all lie along the south coast of China and even into modern-day Vietnam. The association of Tuantai coming from the south is not surprising and alludes to a maritime trade in rattan, rattan usage, and rattan furniture from South Asia via the maritime Silk Roads. Rattan itself, as we said, grows in Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, India, Sri Lanka, Laos, and Thailand, and can now be found in Hainan Island and South China more generally. Jihan's Nanfang Cawu Zhuang references several kinds of exotic vines in the south, though like many early descriptions, this text lingers on byproducts like fruit and nectar without alluding to craftsmanship in any way. It's therefore unlikely that these are rattan plants being described, or even if they are rattan, these are not understood as being a crafting material. Only the now lost pre-Sui Shu dated Linhai Shui Tu Yi Wu Zhi that references rattan, stating, the stalk of rattan is several sun in diameter. It is as heavy as bamboo and can be used to make staffs and thin strips for the binding of ships and also for making mats. It surpasses bamboo as a crafting material. Unfortunately, the dating of this text is not entirely clear. Nevertheless, the first assumption then that the adoption of fixed frame rattan chairs relied on a sufficient supply of rattan and experience working with this material is made evident by sources relating to the hourglass stool. Now we move to discuss the function and adoption of the hourglass stool and how this trajectory adds to our understanding of the rapid move to chair seating across the 8th to late 11th centuries. When we compare the textual record and the material record, we then have two potential routes of transmission. Textual records describe materials and production centers existing in the south, with possible connections to the Indian coastline and beyond, which you can see here. These texts also state that rattanware produced in the south were given as tribute to the Tang capitals. But the depictions of such stools in Dunhuang manuscripts and murals continues to attest to a Buddhist, Indic, or Central Asian influence in how these furniture items were to be depicted and who was using them. Indeed, the visual corpus alludes to the peoples and religions of India and Central Asia, with transmission of this image, and perhaps the stools themselves, coming from overland routes. Material remains suggest then that the hourglass stools were used in a visual or literal sense by male Buddhist figures, female Buddhist lay believers, Central Asian men, male scholars, and palace women. Texts instead place these items in the realm of tribute trade to the court and equally as gifts from the court as well. Houjing, a region in the Liang dynasty, would also be clearly included in this courtly category. The earliest user of these stools, taking the sources as a whole, seems to be the courtly category, dating to the mid-6th century, including Houjing and Liu Xiaoyi, followed by the Sogdian sarcophagus of 573. This would suggest in the 6th century, the hourglass stool remained a relatively rare item, perhaps restricted to the luxury gift economy. Over the 7th century, it begins to appear in Buddhist depictions in Dunhuang and is increasingly associated with women in religious and secular ceramics, murals, and sketches alike. However, Haifeng's tribute, as recorded in 801, was still only one such tuantai, indicating that these were not necessarily commonplace, widely produced furniture pieces. Just because we see these stools in a variety of depictions does not mean that they were as commonly seen in real life. Such stools may have been owned, traded, and made in actuality, but these stools were also a visual motif, repeated in images which are situated in half-real spaces. A key link between the visual repertoire of these stools would clearly be Buddhism. There are several depictions of Buddhist figures sat on pedestals, platforms, and stools. Lotus pedestals could resemble the shape of an hourglass at points, but the Buddhist figure sits cross-legged atop this structure, so we cannot be sure if this is intended as a stool or a variation on the traditional lotus pedestal. There are also depictions of clearly seated Buddhist figures, with the feet sometimes resting on a kind of footstool, often another lotus. But again, the architecture of the seat itself is unclear. There are, however, some hourglass stools in earlier Buddhist depictions. The earliest examples can be seen in the 5th century at sites like the Bingling Temple. On the lower register of the west wall of cave 169 and dated to around 400, a contemplative bodhisattva can be seen sat on a rattan hourglass stool. We can see in more detail here. There's the waistband and there's the rattan coming down. A further depiction from the north wall and dated to around 428 to 430 may also show a similar stool. Marilyn Martin-Ree has also identified a cross-ankled Maitreya in cave 169 of Madzishan as being sat on a no longer extant ribbed stool with a clear waistband, which you can just see down here. This design shows strong similarities with the first ceramic we saw with the lapdog. Ceramics from the north also show rattan stools in the context of Buddhist art. We see a northern way piece here with a contemplative Maitreya, contemplative bodhisattva, sorry. We can see sat on a woven stool in a northern way piece here. We can see a contemplative Maitreya from 575 with cloth over the rattan hourglass stool. And we can also see a stele of 2 bodhisattvas, here again likely Maitreya, from 565, which shows 2 high-waisted hourglass stools. Woven hourglass stools in religious art can thus be traced back to around 400 in China, with clear connections to Buddhism, specifically the contemplative Maitreya, and in particular to the region of Gandhara. This is because several rattan stools, though unwaisted, can be seen in schist from this region, dating to the late 4th to early 5th centuries. If the image of hourglass rattan stools had entered the visual repertoire of China via the medium of Buddhism as early as 400, then how did these pieces come to be depicted as the seats of scholars, women and regents? Firstly, the visual motif that had arrived a century earlier than any known ownership of such stools in China was itself likely based on actual furniture pieces owned in India, but these items would be much slower in filtering into China. By 550 at the latest, the textual record states that rattan could be harvested in Yanzhou to the far south, likely via maritime trade in materials and plants, though this is very difficult to trace. We can only imagine that over time, these stools became associated with power and prestige, both in terms of their craftsmanship and materiality, but also due to their links with powerful Buddhist figures like contemplative bodhisattvas and Maitreya above all. With a firm footing in Buddhist visual art, we see artists in the Kizil Caves and Dunhuang incorporate such stools into religious murals and manuscripts. With production in the south, the distances covered to transport these wares to Dunhuang would have been extraordinary, though not impossible. In Dunhuang, it seems more likely, without material remains to attest otherwise, that the image or motif of the stools alone was familiar. This is reiterated by the absence of Tuanti in Paleo-Chinois 3723, which preserves Liu Zhiyan's 866 copy of Jishi Beiyao. Despite only being partially extant, the contents for the final of 3 juan list gifts for which one could write a song or thank you note for. Alongside lapdogs, horses, and pomegranates are rugs, fans, wooden neck rests, folding chairs, and a nuanzor or warm seat, which is unclear. Hourglass stools are not mentioned. Though this list is far from exhaustive, it is interesting to note the absence of any reference to rattan more generally as well. However, rattan hourglass stools did reach the capital as tribute, and so ceramics of palace women perched on these stools was likely based on actual ownership and use of these stools, albeit perhaps limited in scope. If we concede that the ownership of such stools in the Liang period was, at least in our transmitted accounts, limited to the elite gift economy and tribute trade, it stands that the craftsmanship, rarity, and Buddhist associations of these items appeal to users of these stools. It's the ceramics of the Tang palace women that are the most striking, and that these are so far removed from the original placement of the hourglass stool as a seat for Buddhist figures, as it largely remained in Dunhuang, with the exception of the practice sketches of Paleo-Chinois 2002, which we'll return to in a moment. We see the women in these ceramics are depicted with birds and lapdogs, both notable exotic animal imports, which were used as a shorthand to furnish palatial scenes in Tang times. Part of Wang Ya's poem, titled 30 Ci on the Palace, reads, "The palace women teach the parrots to talk, but this is mastered early on. After a while, they grow accustomed to being locked in their golden cages and take it as their fate. The snow-white lapdog's fur," they're also termed as war in the transmitted accounts, "the snow-white lapdog's fur brushes the floor as it walks. It is used to sleeping on a red carpet and never startles. How many people come in this deep into the palace anyway? It only barks at the evening fireflies on the golden steps at dawn." Yuan Zhen unites the image of the lapdog and the parrot in his poem, 70 Rhymes on Spring Sleepwalking, a poem written about his friendship with fellow poet Bai Zhuyi. Part of this then reads, "In an instant comes the hour when the sun slowly rises, disturbing the people who are about to awaken. The parrots, hungry and chaotic, cry out. The cosseted war or lapdog sleeps as if it is angry." At the coming of dawn, then, the parrots call with impatience to be fed, while the lapdog twitches in its sleep, seemingly angered by the disturbance. Similarly, Li Kuo writes in his poem, 10 Rhymes on the Journeys of a Chang'an Youth, "The junior wife teaches the parrot, its head inclined squawking wakes the drunkards. The dog, cosseted, sleeps on a jade mat. The eagle pulls on its tether, shaking its metal bells." They're not specified here as a lapdog. The fact this dog is both pampered and provided with a sleeping mat is entirely reminiscent of those seen in other lapdog sources. It is clear that the lapdog and the parrot were both essential components of the same palatial scene. Returning to the question of the hourglass stool then, we see them positioned as the accessories of palace women, which are often toying with lapdogs and parrots, themselves a shorthand for both the material wealth of the palace, but also the intense seclusion and boredom these women endured. The stool here is thus another shorthand for material wealth and prestige, tangentially derived from its original Buddhist implications. A furniture item perhaps used in India was compressed into an image, transmitted slowly through overland routes to sites like the Bingling Temple, Madishan, the Kizil Caves, and the Mogao Caves as a seat for Buddhist figures, and was incorporated into locally produced religious art over the course of the 5th and 6th centuries. At the same time, maritime trade, presumably prior to the mid-6th century, brought with it new plants and crafting techniques, meaning that such seats could be fabricated in China by 550 at the latest. These were initially luxury goods of limited quantity, adding to their prestige and their association with power. Slowly, over the course of the 6th and 7th centuries, it seems, this luxury seat became another shorthand for the material wealth enjoyed and amassed by the emperor. Beautiful palace women, dressed in rich clothing, toying with exotic animals, were imagined as being sat on these splendid seats. The hourglass stool thus became a furniture item once again. It would then seem that such an image, with the hourglass stool now as a shorthand for aesthetic beauty and material wealth, made its way back to Dunhuang, as the repetitions of women on stools in Paleo-Chinois 2002 makes clear. From this, we can return to the 3 assumptions that allow for the widespread adoption of shongchuang and the resultant fixed frame chair. Firstly, supplies of rattan were clearly plentiful enough by the Liang, and certainly the Tang period, to produce a larger quantity of rattan furniture. Production centers in the south, perhaps staffed by Han Chinese craftsmen, though it is not made particularly clear, were able to supply these goods via local and perhaps imported rattan. There was also a familiarity with rattan and similar materials like bamboo that allow for complex variations of designs and local adaptations. Secondly, dates allude to these stools growing in prevalence parallel to the increasing references to shongchuang and huchuang in texts, making it likely that both the hourglass stool and the shongchuang were seen by certain groups to have a purpose. This was likely different to the clear function of the shongchuang as a meditation tool or space, for early adopters of chair sitting. The strong association of the hourglass stool with aesthetics, The strong association of the hourglass stool with women and exotic animals like parrots and lapdogs alludes to 2 things. First, that the stool itself was a luxury exotic commodity in the same vein as these animals, and therefore an additional shorthand for material wealth and prestige. And second, that it was heavily imbued with an aesthetic connotation. Despite being pictured in religious and mortuary art among two different cultures, that of Indic Buddhism and that of Central Asian Zoroastrianism, the stool was clearly understood not as a ritual space, but as an aesthetic one that underlined comparative high status and the performance of luxury. Thirdly, the hourglass stool clearly found a use in secular life, particularly among women. Though it is not clear what exact purpose this stool had, it entered the palace and the home alike without being abandoned for being impractical. The stool, like the Dunhuang, which also found a place among palace women, encouraged raised seating with the legs hanging down, and its portability facilitated its use in different times, spaces, and functions. While the shengchuang had a clear use and a shape that supported that function, the hourglass stool was much more usable for a variety of activities. While the Dunhuang has been credited with the ascendancy of folding chairs and the shengchuang with fixed frame chairs, the hourglass stool ought to be included in such discussions, as the adoption of the hourglass stool speaks to a growing variety of raised seats made available, made use of, and made into something different than what they were initially. Involving maritime and overland Silk Road trade, the movement of merchants and pilgrims, and the adoption and adaptation of this technology by craftsmen, image makers, and the elite, the hourglass stool is itself a wonderful example of the complex and interweaving narratives of this time period. When I conceived of this talk over the summer, I had taken inspiration from the sources depicting lapdogs alongside hourglass stools and rectangular fringed rugs. As I researched these topics further, I came to realize that little had been said about the Rattan hourglass stool, even though the topic of the chair and of changing sitting customs was relatively well studied. On the other hand, the round fringed rugs that caught my eye in the process of delving deeper into fringing had been neatly slotted into the history of dance and music in Tang China. I therefore found myself lingering on the Rattan stool and how it adds to our understanding of changing seating practices and even materiality in this period. The rug, here the round fringed rug, is therefore more of a side note in the study of the increasingly varied ways people interacted with chairs and with mats during this liminal time period between chair and mat seating. In the world of mat sitting, we saw the mat had become an arena for etiquette and social hierarchies to play out in a physical space. With the move to chair sitting, it is the chair and its associates that become the domain of etiquette, etc. The rug and mat then are left in a temporary vacuum, or perhaps they are open to new, broader interpretations. Rugs and mats can be seen in various depictions in Dunhuang, often being prayer mats or spaces for monks and donors to be seated in Buddhist works. Once again, the mat is a space reserved for seating, even if for religious or ritual purposes at points, rather than simple secular practices like socializing or eating. The placement of round fringed rugs is therefore quite incongruous with our expectations of how rugs and mats were used in medieval China. We've already seen glimpses of pattern fringed rugs in our previous discussion, with one being laid out underneath an hourglass stool in Paleo-Chinois 2598. But these round fringed rugs were not sat on, but were rather stood on. I'd initially been seeking to answer the question of how fringing entered Chinese textile manufacturing, but of course, such a topic proved impossible to narrow down enough to fit within the timeframe of this talk. The round fringed rugs caught my eye soon on, and so I hope to present some sources relating to these carpets. I am, I must admit, not a textile specialist, so I'm sure my hypothesis may be altered and perhaps immediately cast aside by the esteemed colleagues who are joining us today. Nevertheless, these rugs have often been centered in discussions of music and performance rather than being considered as an object in and of itself. We see one such round fringed rug in a mural from the western wall of a tomb discovered in 1994, but excavated in 2017 in the area of Fuping. This Tang tomb has been identified as belonging to Li Daojian, grandson of Emperor Gaozu. Here we see a woman posed on a round fringed rug with a pearl roundel. Two female attendants watch on as she raises her arm and sleeve. This posture is strongly indicative of dancing. Another mural, excavated in 2014 from the tomb of Han Shuo, Prime Minister, albeit briefly, under Xuanzong, which features a similar scene, though here both a man and a woman can be seen dancing on individual round fringed rugs, again with a pearl roundel. The relatively recent excavation of these two elite tomb murals has incited much scholarly interest, particularly as these pertain to the music and dance aesthetics of the 7th and 8th centuries. While great attention has been paid to the style of dance and the links this shares with Central Asia, it is the carpets themselves that I wish to discuss in greater detail. As this mural makes clear, both the dancers and the musicians are positioned on pattern fringed rugs with pearl roundels. Equally, the dancing scenes from the north wall of Mulgao Cave 220 show another scene of dancing. So we can see the dancers down here, and I'm going to zoom in on this here. So this is the musicians and the dancers, you can see. And I will show you the dancers in more detail here. Here again, we have 4 dancers positioned on round fringed rugs with pearl roundels, and the musicians, which we saw a moment ago, were positioned on large patterned rectangular fringed rugs. Xia Wutian, in analyzing this mural, has drawn attention to the lamps being lit next to the dancers. There's a lamp tree to either side of the dancers, which we'll see in a moment, and there's a lamp tower here in the center, which connects this composition to the nighttime revels associated with the Lantern Festival, which was celebrated on the 15th day of the first month. As Xia points out, most murals in the Mulgao caves have a music and dance scene, which are usually very similar or prescriptive in nature. He notes the addition of the lighting devices as being unique, and from there explores the nighttime revels of the Lantern Festival. However, these music and dance scenes are not all the same, with only some of these scenes, including the round fringed rug with a pearl roundel. For instance, the southern wall of the same cave, cave 220, does make use of these rugs. We can see them very clearly here and here. While another scene from the later Yulin cave 25, which shows Western Paradise scene, does not. Instead, the dancer is just positioned on a rectangular rug with a pearl roundel and fringing. Here, we also see a 9th century Dunhuang painting, which shows the paradise of Shakyamuni, and he just dances on kind of general carpeting, which stretches all the way across the platform. A 9th century ink painting also presents a lack of round fringed rugs. We see the spectators or attendants are sat on plain rectangular rugs, and the musicians are again arranged on a rectangular fringed rug. But the dancer does not have a round rug beneath her feet. Clearly, round rugs were inconsistently conceived of as performance spaces, though fringe rugs in general do seem to be considered more clearly as performance spaces for musicians and dancers alike. The question then is, first of all, how these rugs became primarily associated with dancing performances, and secondly, why it seems to be so inconsistently applied in these scenes, particularly in the 8th and 9th centuries. For the round fringe rugs association with dancing, we once again turn to the Silk Road for answers. A famous pastime of the early Tang period was watching performances of foreign dances, i.e. the acrobatic hutong and the whirling huxuan. Both are described rapturously in Tang poetry. For instance, on the hutong, the poem Night Viewing of the Hu Leaping Dance, the hutong, at the Palace Assistant Secretary Mr. Wang's residence states, "People rarely see a barbarian of the Shi state dancing in front of the banquet. His movement is as swift as a bird. The woven barbarian hat is of a pointed top. The barbarian jacket, made of refined cotton, has 2 narrow sleeves. His hand drops the wine cup. He looks into the west, suddenly thinks of the distant road to his hometown. He jumps like a rolling wheel, and his precious belt sounds. His feet move vivaciously, and his boots are soft. Audiences in all 4 directions sit in silence with goggling eyes, a bamboo flute and a pipa with a tilted head. He jumps energetically on the new carpet of snowy and crimson fur. He whisks light flowers under red candles. When the banquet nearly ends, the dance stops and the music becomes silent. On the west of the hibiscus, I see a waning moon." Clearly, this acrobatic dance is performed on some kind of carpet of white and red down, understood as being wool by Albert Dien. As for the Huxuan, it is said that Yang Guifei learned this dance, and the 2 poems on this topic in the Quentang Shi collection both frame the female whirling dancers as performing in the reign of Emperor Xuanzong. However, there is no reference to a carpet in these poems, or indeed most of the textual references which describe these dances. The Huxuan performance is inextricably tied to Xuanzong's court in poetry, and in particular his accumulation of foreigners in the palace, itself a politically charged message for the expanding reaches of the empire, attracting peoples from far and wide. Nevertheless, an in-depth study of the dance itself is far beyond the purview of this talk, which is centered on the rugs rather than the dancers. We see the same rugs in some, though again not all, dance scenes featuring Central Asian men, with these depictions all dating to the 6th century. These dancers are presumably performing dances in the vein of the hutong or huxuan, given the starkly similar positioning of these men and with the men and women seen on the two murals thus far. I can only apologize for the quality of this image, which is from Yu Hong's sarcophagus, but hopefully you can just about see, if I just move this a little bit, hopefully you can just about see one leg and another leg, and there's the little round carpet at the bottom. We can also see on the brown pilgrim flask a slight variation here. The fringing here has become little lotus petals. Two Central Asian dances can also be seen mid-whirl on individual round fringe rugs on tomb doors, which are dated to around 700. It is evident that this particular rug, with or without the pearl rondelles, was an important, though not entirely necessary element of these dance performances, intended to highlight the dancers' whirling motions while remaining largely in place. The movement and speed of these dances is emphasized by the small rug large enough to only really support one foot on the ground, adding dynamism to the kicked up or back leg mid-swing. We even have a Tang Yuer depicting a warrior stood on the same round fringe rug with a leg raised, perhaps engaged in some form of warlike dancing. The round fringe rug was thus linked to the hutong or huxuan dancing performed by Central Asian men and women, particularly in the court of Emperor Xuanzong. It should be noted that the pearl rondelle itself, particularly in textiles, is heavily associated with turfan and with sogdiana, as shown by silks unearthed in Astana. The samit technique of weaving was far better suited to such designs than techniques used in China at the time. And as Matteo Comparetti points out, we see clear parallels between textiles from Astana, such as this one, and paintings of textiles from Afresab dated to the 7th century. Even the very design of these rugs thus alludes to Central Asian artistic techniques. However, the two murals show evidently Chinese women, not Central Asian women, dancing on these rugs. Casting our eyes back to the mural from Han Xiu's and Li Daojian's tombs, it is noteworthy that the man in Han Xiu's tomb mural is positioned in a very similar way to the Central Asian dancers seen thus far, and is accompanied by both Han Chinese and Central Asian performers. It seems likely, with his leg kicking up behind, that he is performing a similar dance to those of the Central Asian dancers discussed thus far. The woman in the same mural mirrors the man's positioning, though she is accompanied by female musicians, all of Han Chinese origin. This mirroring suggests that both perform the same dance, likely the huxuan, which is described as a paired dance in some Tang poems. However, the woman from Li Daojian's tomb is positioned quite differently, with one arm raised high and the other hanging down, letting the sleeves fall. While both women have long sleeves and dance on a round fringed rug, the example from Li Daojian's tomb is not at all similar to the female huxuan dancers we saw in Cave 220, who dance on one leg with swirling ribbons all around them, nor does she have a pair to whirl with. Instead, this positioning is far more reminiscent of Chinese sleeve dancing, as seen in two Tang ceramics here. It would seem then that the round fringed rug was so deeply associated with dancing, specifically dancing at imperial or elite banquets as performed by foreign dancers, that they could act as a shorthand for elite dancing more widely. Even sleeve dancing could adopt the markedly foreign staging of the round fringed rug. Nevertheless, this may still be a representation of a foreign dance, as based on a similar posture being adopted by a male Central Asian dancer in a tomb mural, which I'll show in a moment. Although I'm not entirely convinced, I still do think it could be sleeve dancing. But why did the round fringed rug appear so inconsistently in dance scenes? Depictions of specifically round fringed rugs wanes over the course of the Tang dynasty. That is not to say that fringed rugs disappear from the visual repertoire of Chinese art, but rather that square or rectangular rugs replace the round rugs as performance spaces, as we see here in the case of Su gosh, tongue twister, Su Sishu's tomb, as well as those seen in Dunhuang. Here, a Central Asian dancer can be seen performing on a square fringed rug, and the edges of rugs can be seen under the musicians as well. Why then do the round fringe rugs disappear while the rectangular fringe rugs do not? This may have been tied to the use of these rugs outside of performances. We saw rectangular fringed rugs used by musical ensembles, as well as being placed underneath the hourglass stool, which was depicted on Paleo Chinois 2598. We see fringed rugs as performance areas for dancers in Dunhuang, and even as a seat for Buddhist figures, including a male donor, which you can just see the remnants of a male donor here, and there's the fringing very clearly. And also, if I move this again out of the way, and also here, this is a sketch for a depiction of Sarasvati. There are further 10th century depictions where donors are also seen seated on rectangular fringed rugs in Dunhuang silk paintings. Particularly striking is the mixing of imagery seen in this early 9th century Dunhuang painting. The dancer strikes an energetic pose reminiscent of those seen so far and is positioned on a large rectangular fringed rug. However, the dancer has a small lotus, which you can just see down here, a small lotus akin to a round fringed rug beneath his standing foot. Here, the motif of both rugs are used at the same time in a way that would be highly impractical for an actual performance. It would seem the image maker combined the familiar staging of the larger rug with the motif of a dynamic dancer with a foot resting on a rug or lotus-petaled rug simultaneously, attesting to either an artistic standard only loosely based on actual performances or an unfamiliarity with how such dances were staged. My supposition is that the changing sitting customs in this period changed the ways performances were arranged. Musicians could remain seated on mats, with the performance space being demarcated by empty space or a mat of some description. As we saw in Han Shizaye Yantu, musicians in the 10th century could be seated on chairs. What must also be considered is the changing popularity of certain dances. While the Huxuan and Hutong involved spinning and somersaulting in place, other dances may not have been so suited to the very small diameter of the round fringed rug, hence the use of larger stages, i.e. rectangular fringed rugs. Equally, with the prevalence of rectangular fringed rugs in other aspects of life, or at least in depictions of other aspects of life, there were a more readily available and familiar item for both image makers and users. We see comparatively far fewer fringe circular rugs in other areas of life beyond these dancing scenes. Those circular woven rugs do remain as a seating option for floor sitting. Those with fringing, however, are scarce from the materials I've researched thus far. This is still a topic I'm working on and will continue to research, so I would appreciate your insights on this phenomenon. In summary, the Tang Dynasty saw the slow adoption of chair seating, and with it a totally different world of gestures, posture, architecture, staging, and socializing. The acceptance of raised seating in the form of fixed frame chairs has been argued solely on the basis of the Huchuang and Shongchuang, comparing and contrasting the form and prevalence of both furniture items in the era before the fixed frame chair. With the inclusion of the Rattan hourglass stool, itself a product of both overland and maritime Silk Road trade, we see that a variety of raised seating options were filtering into the artistic canon of the time and into the home of the elites. With sufficient supplies of rattan, a familiarity with sitting with the legs hanging down, and an aesthetic function, we see that the study of the rattan hourglass stool adds to our understanding of the mechanics of adopting and adapting chair seating. Similarly, with a move away from floor sitting, rugs begin to take on new roles under these raised seating furniture items. So too did one rug, the round fringed rug, become a motif for exuberant and energetic movement. Once again, a furniture item with an aesthetic function derived from Silk Road interactions became, for a moment in time, a shorthand for foreignness, wealth, and here entertainment. The short-lived rise of the round fringed rug shows a recognition of the rug or mat as more than an arena where social concerns could be manifested. It could also stage, quite literally, those outside the local shared standards of etiquette or normative behavior. With the inclusion of these two furniture items, themselves products of intense cultural exchange, we see that the move from floor seating to chair seating was truly revolutionary, and the boundaries of such a topic must be widened to include even peripheral phenomena such as those discussed today. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Well, thank you, Kelsey, for this very rich introduction to the world of rattan and rugs. And we'll turn now to, as you phrased it, to the esteemed colleagues who joined us today and open the floor for discussion. So please, if you have a question, speak up, or maybe put something in the chat, or you can just speak up. Yes, Ro.
Kelsey, thank you very much. That was very rich. I was thinking at the beginning of your talk when you were sort of giving these early examples, on sitting and maths. You probably should mention Mencius's mother, right? That's the most famous math episode. And what's interesting about that is, of course, that the whole issue there is that the way in which you sit, the way in which your mat spread out is obviously influencing, in her case, the fetus. But it raises an interesting question that is between sitting, posture and sort of physical and psychological well-being, right? And you can see that in the medical context, or perhaps even in the in the religious context, in the context of traditions of meditation, right, and Dunhuang and all these things, that there's a link between these items, not simply as luxury items or practical pieces of furniture, but perhaps also, the sort of health and well-being of the people who use them. And I was wondering whether you've seen any traces of that in those medieval materials.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it's something that came up more in secondary sources than any of the primary sources that I came across. A lot of the secondary sources were speaking about how people who are very adjusted to mat sitting and floor sitting would have developed completely different muscles to be able to hold that posture, and that when you move to chair sitting, that's just as uncomfortable for someone who's very used to floor sitting as it would be for someone who's used to chair sitting to change to mat sitting. Interestingly, I never really saw that much yet that was speaking about the discomfort people must have felt switching to a different form of seating. The only thing I can think of is really the fact that when Yi Jing is talking about these monks not sitting properly on these chairs, they're not sitting with their legs hanging down, they're sat cross-legged on top of the actual stool. I wonder if that was because it was just more comfortable for them to sit that way, not necessarily because they didn't know how to sit properly. So I definitely think that's something to look into in medicinal texts. I don't know whether even chair sitting would have been prescribed, but that would be a really interesting thought, whether certain forms of seating were actually used medicinally. That's definitely something I should look into. So thank you very much.
Okay, and in the chat, we have a question which you cannot see, but it's a question from Michelle Wang, who is on a mobile phone. So she asked me to read it. So thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, Kelsey, for your fascinating talk. From visual and literary sources, huchuang and stools were associated with mobility. Are you thinking about this, especially as intersecting with gender? And she added, mobility or portability. What might this suggest about lifestyle or gender norms?
That's a really interesting point, because the huchuang we see described in text as being able to be folded, and we see it being carried by women, just as we see that example of a woman carrying what looks like an hourglass stool. So there's definitely an element of portability. What these stools eventually become, at least in the case of the hourglass stool, is we see in the Song period a lot of garden stools that were used out in outside spaces. So I'm wondering if that was, at least in the context of the hourglass stool being used by palace women, I'm wondering if it was part of this inside-outside lifestyle where they were being moved between different spaces. I'm not entirely sure. The issue is a lot of texts just don't talk about how these stools were being used and why. We've kind of got to piece it together as we go. I do think it's interesting that women are seen carrying portable items of furniture. I definitely think it alludes to the fact that there were changing spaces with these chairs, but I'm not entirely clear on why. But it's a really interesting point.
Okay, other Heini, yeah.
Hi, thanks, Kelsey. That's a great
Hi.
topic and great presentation. Thanks very much. A couple of things that came to my mind when you were actually showing us a few texts. One from the Xintangshu
Yes.
basically mentions rattan dishes. I just wonder what they are, if any. If you know what they're talking about, but also there was a mention of rattan being used for shipbuilding.
Yes.
Now, when I'm looking at rattan and in this context, it's an expensive material. It must be in order, to what would you use it for? More for build a ship or to make a stool? And also there was a comparison of compared with bamboo, it's easier.
Yes.
It's better to be crafted. So in this sense, I'm just thinking, yes, it is an item of tribute, but it is also an expensive material.
Yeah.
And the value of it may also lie in that, as well as being, sort of a tribute item. Just wondered your thoughts on that.
Yes, absolutely. I do think that at least it must have been in the early period before rattan was actively cultivated within China. It certainly must have been more difficult to get hold of, one would imagine, and therefore more expensive as a material. With the binding of ships, that's not the only reference to that kind of thing. I thought I saw something about binding ships with vines more generally, but it wasn't clear whether that was rattan or not. So I'm wondering if that reference is to the ability to kind of make binding out of rattan in just a more general sense. I'm not sure whether that was something partaken in the Tang, but it certainly must have been used in places where rattan grew abundantly and was therefore not such an expensive material. But yeah, it's very interesting. The rattan dishes, I haven't seen anything yet for, and I've been looking out for them as I've been researching, and I would love to see what rattan dishes look like. I can only imagine they have a dish-like shape and that they're kind of like a woven basket shape, but I'm still on the lookout. So if anyone spots a rattan dish in their travels, please.
Sorry, what character is used for the dish?
The rattan dish was just like, I think it was pan.
Just pan.
Yeah, just
it
pan.
actually can be just a tray, frankly.
Yeah, it might just be a tray. Yeah, I just haven't seen any yet. I've been looking around in scenes of houses or paintings, and I just haven't spotted one yet. I'm gonna have to do that as a long footnote gone wild, I think.
But you had a tray in one of your images.
Oh, did I? Is this the one with the label
in
lever, the
front
female
of it.
label lever? Yes, I think it is. Let me show that again. Let me show. Just got to put up with me as I go backwards, hopefully. Ooh. Let me just get that slide up for you. I know the exact one you mean. I know it's a woven material, but I haven't yet been able to figure out if it is rattan here. And then if I go here. Oh, gosh, sorry. Let me go through. Tech is not my strong suit, you can tell. Here.
Yeah.
So we can see items down here that I think look woven. At least this table looks quite woven. But I'm not entirely clear because it does look quite different to the stool itself. So it's quite ambiguous.
So that might not be a table, but an actual a dish with a,
It's a so-called tadza, isn't it? It's these trays on foot, which
yeah,
the tongue, and there are many examples in Sansai wares. So.
Yeah, interesting. Then, if it's normally in Sansai, and here it does have an appearance of being woven. So I will look into that for sure.
Thank you. Thanks.
No worries. Thank you so much.
May I add something?
yes,
Sure.
To this, Susan Huang. Thank you so much for this really very rich presentation. When you talk about all these different pieces of furniture, I can by thinking about Yang Zhishui's various studies. And in fact, I just quickly look at her book. This is one of the book that she talked about Dunhuang 艺术名物丛考. So the title 曾有西风半点香. There is a particular chapter that she talked about 床 and 盘, and one particular 床 that she talked about, it's called 牙床, and you know,
yes.
I'm fishing for this term in your presentation. I heard that you talk about 胡床 and 绳床, but it didn't to me that you touch upon this. So I thought it would be interesting that you check out her study and then, you know, see how you would like to respond to her material. Quite a lot of Dunhuang murals as well as Shoso-in materials.
Yes.
As well. Right, and so that is just a side comment, a reference. Do have my own questions, two questions. One regarding the first session on the 床 and stool, and the other regarding the rock. So first, all these wonderful detailed research on the stool and 床. I was wondering, you know, I really appreciate your meticulous mapping of where these kind of exotic objects might have been introduced to China. But, you know, another tantalizing question would be how did the Chinese receive these designs? And perhaps because you mentioned about local adaptation. And so, you know, Chinese has a very sophisticated furniture culture by itself. And, you know, how did the furniture made in China domesticate these exotic elements? And so I was wondering if you know, if this research could be expanded further. One study question to think about is this hybrid design made in China, you know, adopting all the forces. Like you say, you know, this is not a linear development, you know, the and you know, in well, my most comfortable historical period is Song and Yuan, and in the Song Yuan material culture, especially Buddhist woodblock print, the printed book, it seems that the chuang furniture was still quite dominating, you know, the Buddhist material culture, but they added something more Chinese to it, namely there's a screen, you know, the Pingfeng was added to the chuang, and the monk was sitting on top of this chuang with a short table, you know, and so all this is really kind of messed up. It doesn't really apply to one way of sitting, but it's more hybrid. And so that's my question. I wonder if you look, you know, can respond to that, or what do you think about my suggestion? And would you like to answer that?
Let's go with that first, and then I'll take the second one while I've still got all my thoughts in my head. Thank you so much for recommending the books that you mentioned. I will absolutely give that a read. There is such a rich scholarship on furniture, but that's why I'm quite surprised that this small stool has kind of been overlooked in that rich scholarship. It'd be very interesting to see her writing, as you mentioned, on the Yashuang. With the adaptation of designs, the issue that we have is that we can't tell where some of these hourglass stools were being produced. What we can see is a difference between some, do you remember the one that was just a pure woven stool, either square or round? And there are some with a lot of negative spacing, and I'm not really sure how to trace that back and figure out which was kind of an adaptation and which wasn't. There certainly seems to be adaptations in where the waistband seems to sit, whether that's in the middle or more at the top, and how much negative space is created, or whether the entire thing was just a woven kind of material. Because it's so difficult to trace, it would only be clear whether there was more hybrid or adapted designs if I could find examples from intermediary sources on the Silk Road somehow, and compare those depictions that we see in a very Chinese context with those that we then see between Gandhara and China. I think that would be very interesting, but it was beyond the remit of trying to fit into this talk, but I definitely want to continue pursuing that in the future.
And of course, we want to be aware of the sources we use. One is the actual furniture, archaeological.
Yes.
And the other is the pictorial representation of this furniture. And so might be always this imagination from the design, the artist's point of view to spice up the design. So take these examples, it is important to kind of make a difference between, the furniture versus the depicted one.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. May I move to the second question?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the rock is fascinating, and I'm so glad that you mentioned have such a detailed study of the fringe rock, because I have been paying attention to this since I was a graduate student, but my focus is more on how this fringe rock was depicted in Chinese paintings. And it's fascinating to see you lay out all these rock related to dancing. But my materials, I can offer some materials that are not really about dancing. There is a wonderful painting in Shanghai Museum depicting lofty scholars, and it's called Gao Yi Tu. It's one of their top 10 paintings, so it's easy to find. It's attributed to a Tang Dynasty painter, Sun Wei, active in Sichuan. And these rocks were all rectangular. While you were talking, I did a double check. But the fringes were so meticulously depicted. I thought that must be, it means something. And so this exotic element of fringe rock, it is something really interesting. And related to that is a painting depicted by a Southern Song Chan Buddhist monk painter, Mu Xi, and it's a painting of Guan Yin in Dai Tokuji collection in Kyoto. And this Guan Yin was sitting on a round fringe rock. And I know, and it's monochrome. And so, I've been trying to make sense of these two paintings, and to me, the painter's connection to Sichuan or Shu, this area, seems kind of intriguing. So I don't know if you have to map out the kind of transmission map of the fringe rock. How do you place Sichuan in this transportation? Like you place.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. And related to this is the other area, and that's the south. I remember the 7 sages of the bamboo grove and Rong Qiqi, this Zhulin Qixian tomb tiles.
Yes.
The scholars were sitting on kind of round mat and I tried to find an online image to see if there are really fringes. I couldn't really see clear fringe.
Yes.
I wonder if you have already examined those sources.
I will definitely look into the 7 sages. You see round mats in other contexts. I've definitely seen round woven mats as being sat on and also as being underneath chairs and tables, but they don't have fringing, and the fringing is the thing I find very interesting. Yeah,
exactly. So this leads to my sub question of the second question. And
sure.
That before the fringe rock was introduced to China, what kind of rock or kind of surface mat did Chinese use? And you can include those examples to kind of highlight the spatial materiality of the rock that you are discussing.
Yes.
So for me, the rock the Chinese use more indigenous way thing, animal skin.
Yes.
Tiger skin, that kind of skin, and you see that kind of mat, used in scholarly paintings and all that. Okay, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I will try and address as many of those points as I can. So I definitely think with the round fringe rugs, you would be able to map them out because there are not that many examples of them. With fringed rugs more generally, there are so many examples, it would be almost impossible to put them on a map. If you look at, I noticed as I was looking at fringed rugs just more generally, that if you look at nearly any ceramic of a Sogdian, normally there's always a fringed mat. If he's on a camel, there's a fringed rug somewhere. If he's hunting, there's a fringed rug somewhere. It's normally fringing somewhere with a Sogdian, which has to be something. There has to be a connection. As for mapping it out and kind of playing with Sichuan's role in that and the South, I think that's going to take me gathering a huge amount of fringed rugs to be able to get there. And I was only centering on the round rug. But I do think having a map sometimes can really clarify what's going on. So I definitely think that's the next stage in looking at these fringed rugs. There are so many examples of the fringed rugs more generally. And I really want to figure out where the fringing came from. Before the fringing, I would completely agree with you. There were animal skins, but they're also very plain mats. I was looking at this paper by Matteo Comparetti that was talking about the actual weaving techniques, and that the weaving techniques we see with the pearl rondelles, with the kind of animal motifs in textiles from Astana, was a completely different technique. So I think that would allude to a very different way of being able to decorate those rugs and being able to shape them as well. Because of the kind of constraints of the different weaving techniques. I will definitely look into the Seven Sages and see if those rugs were fringed. I feel like I see so many circular rugs, I get very excited, I zoom in, no fringing. Yeah, it can be challenging. But I will have to email you later and we can discuss all of the sources, because I know you're a wealth of knowledge on the history of art. So,
but I'm highly inspired. You know, from now on, I'll look very closely at rugs.
You'll notice them everywhere.
Okay, thank you
so much.
Okay, Kelsey, you have a question by Xueman Shen.
Oh, yes, I see. I wonder if you could say a bit more about the two Gandharan stone carvings. Are you sure they depict stools? They appear to be high-backed chairs. Yes. So the thing with these stools, especially in Buddhist context, it's very hard to tell whether there is a separation between the base, which could be a stool, and then a large kind of halo shape behind, or whether there is a connection and it's intended as a high-backed chair. With the Gandharan ones that I showed, I believe that they are the latter, where it's a halo that is not attached to the base, that's a stool. And I'm following Marilyn Martin Ree on this analysis. So I will double check, but I believe that they were separate. But that is true in a lot of images where we can't see the back entirely. It's very difficult to tell whether that is a stool or it's a chair, especially in an Indian context.
Okay, so we have time maybe for one question or one item of criticism. Okay, Xueman replied, so maybe
yes, Changsha. Yeah, so the round fringe rug that I showed underneath the warrior is a Changsha ware from the 9th century, and maybe that could change my chronology. Yes, I agree. I'm trying to figure out the chronology of where these round fringe rugs begin to die out and begin to be replaced more widely with just square or rectangular fringed rugs. I think there are some exceptions, but I don't really see them dating other than this Yua, which itself is very strange because it's not really a dancer. It seems to be a warrior doing some kind of dance. It's very atypical as a whole. But I will definitely look at some other Changsha ware and see if that does come up more often in that particular ware than in other depictions. Absolutely. So thank you very much for pointing that out.
All right, thank you, Xueman. So if there are no more questions, then I think our time is just about up.
I see Heini raising a hand.
Okay, yes, please.
Sorry, can I just ask one more question?
Absolutely.
The lady, the Tang lady from the Metropolitan Museum.
Mm-hmm, yes.
That always struck me. Just surprises me the seat that she's in, sort of her legs crossed in front,
Yes.
very unladylike. And this has always puzzled me, thinking, well, you know, but then if we think of it sort of in these sort of Buddhist contexts,
Yes.
so you get going figures seated like that, and in a way, you know, it kind of starts making sense almost, seeing her in that very unladylike pose.
Yes.
I don't know whether you've sort of, you know.
Absolutely. I had the exact same thought process. I obviously first saw that ceramic in the context of researching lapdogs. So I saw this lady and I was like, this is a bit strange. I've never really seen a lady sit like this normally in ceramics. And as I was researching with a lot of the contemplative bodhisattvas, they're in a very similar position with that discarded shoe, with the shoe on the ground. And that suddenly made so much more sense for why this Tang ceramic was being depicted in that way. I think it's borrowing very heavily from the image of the contemplative bodhisattva on this hourglass stool, but I don't think it's funny because it doesn't seem to be religious. It seems to be a secular image that's borrowing very heavily from religious iconography, which I think makes a really nice kind of bridge between this aesthetic function of the stool and this, not necessarily religious, but its use in a religious space. And I just find that really interesting. It definitely was my launching pad on this whole thing. So yeah, I do definitely think, as Heini stated, it's very much really shows the complexities of this particular furniture item really well.
Or if we just think of that sort of you know, seat, it's almost like the royal seat or latitasana, and the seat of contemplation, you know, and maybe she's in deep thought of something. Maybe, you know, I've never thought of it before like that, but it kind of, I think it makes a lot of sense. You know, so yeah.
Thank you so much. Absolutely, I completely agree.
Susan?
Just say that I agree with Kelsey's reading, that this is probably a kind of workshop practice that the designer, you know, kind of mismatch the kind of prototypes together. And the similar observation could be applied to the Bishamen Tianwang that you analyzed earlier.
Yes.
Compare, you know, you try to identify that sketch at the back of the Dunhuang manuscript as the Bishamen, and you use another example to compare. And I think that whoever drew that guardian figure, you know, is thinking a kind of established iconography. And so so this is kind of complicated.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's not straightforward, but that's why it's so interesting to try and puzzle it out.
All right, so our time is definitely up, and let's thank Kelsey for the wonderful talk. And I'm going to turn off the recording.